Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning. And my name is Joanna Daniel. For those who are new to this page, I am founder of Wounds to Scars. I'm a counselor and an author. And we do retreats and conferences that provides a safe place for survivors of childhood trauma to heal. Now, as you see the topic, I want to give a trigger warning at the beginning of this video as well, because the content might be a little bit emotive. So I'm also going to put a trigger warning in the description. So I get asked this question a lot when I'm doing an assessment, say in private practice, and I got asked this question in a training event I was doing over the weekend. When I'm training or when I'm assessing usually somebody from Africa, and this is not by no means a cultural thing, but I'm saying this because I want us to really hear it in context, and I know. We manage behavior differently depending on our context, but this is a really important question that was asked. Somebody asked, and I get asked all the time, because when I'm assessing someone at the beginning of therapy, I usually do the adverse childhood questionnaire just to see if there's any trauma or if the person come not knowing, right? And the first question usually is around physical abuse, and they would say, well, I'm from Africa, I was beaten, is that abuse? And I don't tell people that they were abused. But if you have that question, I think it's really important to ask yourself that question, because we know that childhood trauma has a long arm, and my tongue got tied saying that, it's a long arm, in the sense that we experience it, and oftentimes because it's unresolved, because as adults, we can minimize things. As adults, we can explain things away. And so we don't address the effects and the impacts of it, and the long arm means that it's carried on through generations, right? So I want to answer the question, and I use the NSPCC just to answer this question, because they work with children and around safeguarding and protection of children. So they define physical abuse as this: slapping, punching, kicking, shaking, throwing, poisoning, burning, scalding, biting, scratching, breaking bones, or drowning. And they say that any way of intentionally causing harm to a child or a young person is physical abuse, right? So, of course, these are not one-off events. If you've been spanked or beaten throughout childhood, you know that that's a lot. You would have been, you know that it wouldn't be a one-off. Lots of times it's not a one-off. It's a continuous thing. Now, here are some of the signs. If you're wondering for yourself, I was beaten. I hear lots of people say this all the time. I mean, for me, that's a little bit troubling for me when I hear this. I was beaten and I was okay, so it's okay. I mean, if that's the school that you're from, that's okay. But for me, that's a little bit troubling. I was beaten, so that's okay. That means it's okay. Rather, I was beaten and I turned out okay. And we know that as adults, we can reason out quite a lot as adults. We can tell ourselves a lot of things that we couldn't tell ourselves as children. So you might grow up and your adult brain is able to make sense of things and reason things out and put your parents' behavior in context and do all of that. You can put your parents' behavior in a cultural context, in whatever context needs to be put in. You can understand them. Your adult self is now going, they love me. But when you were a child and you were beaten continuously, sometimes for minor infractions, sometimes for no infraction at all. I know people that were beaten just in case they did something wrong. They were beaten just in case you did something wrong. I know people that were beaten because their siblings did something wrong and everybody was beaten for it, right? So yeah, they turned out okay in the sense that they have really good careers. They're professionals and, at the top of their field and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect, right? So they can reason it out. In the conversations, when these conversations are happening, people are laughing. However, the effects are still there. So here are some of the signs of physical abuse. And, if you are listening to this as an adult and you're working with children, you want to really look at the signs. Because sometimes if we don't understand it for ourselves, what it was, and process it for ourselves, we'll excuse the behavior in other people. And so when children are telling us what's going on for them, we're going to minimize it because we minimized it for ourselves. So even if you minimize it for yourself, I want you to hear this in context, especially if you work with children. So there are some signs like bruises, broken bones, and scarring and injuries. So if a child is scarred, the bones are broken, I mean, that one's really clear and plain. But there'll be some consistent things. There'll be a pattern of behavior. There'll be a pattern of bruises. There'll be all of that are signs for you that this is physical abuse is going on here, right? And physical abuse will sometimes be accompanied by other things. There'll be other things going on as well, right? And so assess that for yourself as well. Was it physical abuse for you? Doesn't mean that you don't love your parents, because sometimes people struggle to process some of the stuff that happened in childhood because of loyalty, out of loyalty for parents and for family. There are people who struggle to say this was this because of loyalty. Now you can choose to process and heal without compromising your loyalty. If that's really important to you, you can process and heal without that being compromised. You can process and heal and still love your parents. You can still love them and look after them, take care of them financially, and process the impact of what you got from them. So, two things can happen at the same time. And sometimes we don't know that those two things can happen. So we push it down and repress it because we're afraid of doing it. But considering the physical and mental effects of repressed pain and for childhood trauma, I think it's really in your best interest and in your family's best interest, if you're helping them, to process, to be honest, to heal so that you can do more. So there is, here's some of the risk factors for physical abuse. So poverty is one. There are mental health issues in the family and neglect. A child that is emotionally neglected will also sometimes be physically abused, right? So neglect is a risk factor. Domestic violence in the family, in the home, is a risk factor. Alcohol in the home is a risk factor. So if you think about your childhood, what were the risk factors for you? Because sometimes parents take their frustration out on their children. Sometimes children are blamed for different things, and sometimes how things are managed. Parents don't have sometimes emotional intelligence in order to manage their own emotions. Because I know as a parent, when my children do something and I get angry, my anger is not their responsibility. I am angry, and I can't blame them for me getting angry regardless of what they do. I have to take responsibility for my anger, and I have to find a way to work through my anger so I can be a safe parent. I need to go work out my anger, find my safe space, and come back and deal with the behavior. But if I deal with the behavior in my anger and I blame them for me being angry, I mean, that's so much power, and that's so unfair. Nobody has that much power. Nobody can make you angry, sad, or anything, right? So we have to take responsibility for our actions. So sometimes people were beaten and blamed for it. If you got good grades, if you got better grades, if you weren't with those friends, if you were well behaved at school, if you weren't rude to the teacher, if you turned up to school early, and the list can go on of minor things that required a conversation but ended up with physical injuries, right? So those are some of the risk factors. But here are some of the effects of physical abuse. So see where you see yourself in this list of effects. And as I said, people who experience childhood trauma is twice more likely to have depression and anxiety, and just our life expectancy. So it really is in our best interest that we process and we heal, we understand it. So some of the effects is anxiety, of course, and you might not be diagnosed with a disorder, right? So you might not be diagnosed with a mental health problem, but you know that you have anxiety, you know that you're anxious, you know that you worry, you know that you live in the past or the future, and you don't have an ability to stay in the present. You know that. You know that day-to-day life sometimes is a challenge because of it, right? You may not connect it to the beating that you got that is minimized, but it's really important to have an understanding of it. So there are also behavior issues. So think about this in terms of yourself as an adult and any child that you're working with. So there are behavior issues too that people who experience physical abuse have. And sometimes there's an inability to manage emotions. Their inability to understand emotions and to manage emotions. Sometimes people can't regulate their emotions. So, you know, those people who are blind and mad and they call themselves plain and straightforward. Sometimes it's that inability to manage the emotions that they have. There's depression, of course, and sometimes there's suicidal thoughts. And of course, there's a longer list of effects. There's also the physical side of it, where I'm looking at, you know, how it impacts mental health. So what I want you to do is to look, where do you find it? Where do you see yourself in this circle? Do you see, you know, did you identify with a list of things that was abused? Were there scarrings? Was there a pattern to the abuse? Did you get hit for things that you look back on and realize that could have had a conversation? Was it a continuous thing? Did you bear any of the signs of abuse? And any of the effects? Are you living with any of the effects that I've read out? And did your family fall into any of those risk factors, right? Now, the risk factors such as poverty and growing up without doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be abused. Lots of poor people don't hit their children. Lots of poor people don't abuse their kids, right? So that on its own is not a risk factor. But there are a lot who do, because the stresses of life can be a lot. And when we're under stress and pressure, then, you know, sometimes we respond in ways that we would not normally have responded in if we weren't under that amount of pressure. Now, I always like to say that this is not a judgment, and this is not a condemning of your parents or your own parenting style. This is an awareness. Let's see this as an awareness conversation, that you're learning to understand physical abuse, and you're learning to understand your experience, and you're learning to see the experiences of children around you. And then it's the next steps. It's the what next. You know, so if I experience physical abuse, what do I do now? Right? And that's a really good question to ask, because that's considered one childhood trauma, and one is enough to make the risk factors, to increase your vulnerability, your risk factors for certain type of illnesses, right? So what do you do next? We provide retreats, conferences, and courses that provides a safe place for people to heal, to start to look at, what's my plan of action? What do I want to do? So we also have counselors available at Wounds to Scars that is experienced in working with this kind of subject matter. But I'm going to put the link for our next event, which is an online retreat. Good morning, which is an online retreat, June 3 to 6. Check out the page, and that could be a place for you to start, to begin to process. If you've already started, the online retreat is still a safe place for you to come. I am the main speaker at that retreat, and I'm going to look at various subjects within. If you go and look at the page, you'll see some of the things that I'll be dealing with at that retreat. We'll have small groups, and you'll have opportunity to have one-to-one coaching with myself and another one of our counselors. So have a look at that, see where you fall in the cycle, and see what you want to do next. Thank you for joining, and thank you for watching the replay. If you're here and watching the replay, let me know. Just say hello below and put #replay.